Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage MethodSpace, and I'm pleased to be joined here today by David Denyer, and we're going to discuss review methods. But before we get started, if you are new to MethodSpace, this is a blog community hosted by Sage Publishing, and we're interested in everything to do with designing, conducting research, writing about it, and sharing results in all different kinds of ways. And you can see at the heart of this diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are a brand new student researcher or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. And that's why I enjoy doing these kinds of interviews, because I always learn something. So David, why don't you begin by introducing yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Janet, and hello, everyone. My name's David Denyer. I'm Professor of Leadership and Organisational Change at Cranfield School of Management in the UK. And I've been doing work on literature reviewing and evidence-based management for probably around 20 years. And I'm really delighted to be here.
Well, let's just begin by define for our viewers what you mean by review research.
Yeah,
I'll put up here the definition that was in the article that you published recently.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good starting point. I think when any of us think about a literature review, we often think of it as being kind of the front end of an empirical paper, or maybe something that we do in our PhDs, because that's kind of like the first chapter that you have to put together for a PhD. I think what we've seen over the last 15, 20 years has been a change in, I guess, the status and the importance of reviewing the literature. And now what you see is more and more really high quality review articles that are legitimate research projects themselves. And review research, literally all we mean by that is that you are applying the same principles and the same standards in terms of rigor and relevance as you would for any research project. And I think that's the really significant difference. A kind of literature review where you'd read through stuff, you'd kind of decide what you think was interesting and important, you kind of put it together, rather than having a much more systematic approach where you're actually using existing sources, existing papers as your data. And I think what's really different about review research is that you have a review question. It's driven by a question, and you're trying to address that question using secondary sources, and you're doing that in a very systematic, rigorous way.
I think it's very interesting to me. So, in one way, thinking, well, it expands the value of the scholarly research that we do. That say, you're not simply, like, say, as a researcher thinking, well, okay, I'm publishing this one article, and I said this, I found this. Here's what we talked about. But how does that fit within, a larger scope? What can we really be able to understand? And I'm personally a qualitative methodologist, so I think about, like, say, with qualitative research, we're going deep, typically deep into a question and trying to gain some insight. But how we can look across a body of research to understand something. So I just wondered, to begin with, how you see, like, say, qualitative, quantitative mixed methods, as a part of review research in terms of kinds of data, but then also in terms of the kinds of methods that you would use to analyze the literature for a review study.
Well, you touched on a couple of really interesting points there, and I'll pick up on the kind of qualitative, quantitative part in a second. But I just wanted to pick up on your initial point, which is really around like the status and nature of kind of review research. And as I said before, really understanding that it is a piece of research that's legitimate and scholarly and really good academic practice in its own right. And I think what we do in many fields, and I think especially so in business and management, is that we often privilege novelty. So what it leads is everyone to go off and do a new piece of research and look at a really tiny aspect of the subject and make a kind of really small incremental contribution to knowledge. But with actually review research, when you can look at the whole of the science base, you can review the whole body of research, you can actually start to ask some different questions. And it always struck me when I got into this area, why would we want to go and ask another question and go and collect more data when we hadn't really understood what do we already know about the subject area? And actually, that's the underpinning basis of kind of an evidence-based management approach or an evidence-based practice approach that you see in other fields, is saying, rather than conduct another study that's going to be always limited in terms of its scale and its sample, let's actually look at what that whole body of literature is saying about our research question. To your second point, review research is kind of method agnostic or data agnostic in the sense that anything can be a form of evidence put into review research. You can review anything that is an existing written source. And it can be qualitative, it can be quantitative, it could be more conceptual in nature. But the key thing is that you're probably just asking very different questions if you are reviewing a body of qualitative research against a body of quantitative research. So if you're looking at the relationship between variables and you want to conduct some additional statistical analysis on a data that you're drawing from those secondary sources and do a kind of meta-analysis, very, very much at the quantitative end. But there are review research methods like meta-ethnography, which takes the qualitative findings from multiple studies and then does a reinterpretation of that data. So review research can be quantitative and qualitative, but what it really shares in common is this need to do it in a very scholarly, systematic and rigorous way.
Right. So what do you suggest to someone who is thinking about doing this kind of research? Starting with the question?
It's always all review research starts with formulation of a question and what are you trying to achieve with the review? What's the goal of the review? What's the purpose? What are you actually trying to do? What's the nature of the question that you've got? And I think it's all driven from that. You know, depending on the nature of the question you've got, you then go into a process of, okay, now how do I locate information that is relevant to that question? You go through a process, regardless of the method, of how do I now select? What's the basis of my selection criteria? And our view is that should be much more explicit and transparent than perhaps it would have been when you did your kind of PhD literature review or the literature reviews on the front end of a paper. Actually say, what is relevant? Why am I including this article? Why am I including this source? What are my criteria for that? Being much more open and explicit about that. And then the next phase would be like, how do I appraise the quality of those articles? What's a good quality? What's good evidence? Can I trust the results of this study? And then it's about synthesizing and analyzing those data sources. So we have to draw information from those, and that might be very different if it's qualitative, because you might be looking at what is the meaning that is coming out in some of that qualitative data, rather than maybe extracting the variables that you're going to deal with in more quantitative sense. So you've got this analysis phase. And then the key thing in synthesis is, and this is where I think review research really does make a contribution in its own right, because you're going to put that literature together, those studies together, into some kind of new arrangement or new theory or new way of thinking or new understanding that takes the field forward. So it's not just being very descriptive and saying, this is the nature of the field, this is what we found, this author says this. It actually tries to make a contribution by trying to explaining, reinterpreting, adding a new, a higher level of, I guess, theorization to what was there before.
Right. And so it would seem to me that, I mean, you can do review research about, when we think about, like, say, the structure of a conventional journal article, we have the introduction. So here we have, what's the problem? Why do we look at this? Why is this important? How do we know this is important? So you think, well, you could do review research where you're looking at how is this problem, whether it's, say, urban poverty or how organizations function or whatever your field may be. So how is the problem understood? That would be one, that would be a way of looking at review research. Or, as a methodologist, I think about, I look at the method. So when I'm looking at research, I look across all kinds of disciplines because I'm interested in how they do it. What are the methods, what are the methodologies? What are the methods? How do they describe it? What are they drawing from to give the rationale for this being the appropriate way to study this problem? So you could do a method, if you're interested in methodology, you could do this kind of research looking at methodology. And I say this because I think that a lot of people, perhaps our viewers here, think about, oh, well, I'm going to take the results and look at how the results are collected across this body of research. But really, you could look at any aspect of the research, or even ethics, the research ethics. Well, how do different people deal with particular problems with vulnerable populations, or consent procedures, or whatever you might be.
And in every one of those excellent examples that you gave, you gave a question. That was the key thing. You framed it as, you could ask this question. And that's the key thing. I think that with the difference between a kind of more traditional literature review and review research is that it's driven by that question. I think, a kind of traditional literature review normally just has kind of a very vague objective, like, what does this literature say about this topic? Whereas you gave a very precise question. It's the same kind of question that you might ask in a more empirical sense. But you're absolutely right. I think that because you touched on there as well in the start of that part, that that the structure might be different in review research. And when you look at review research, it does look more like the write-up of a piece of any piece of research. It has an introductory chapter. It has a method statement. So there's a method section to it, because you say how you have undertaken that review research. You have a findings section, you have a discussion section, you have an overall conclusion section. So in that sense, it is structured in exactly the same way as a research, any research paper. But you're absolutely right. You could ask a question about the topic itself that you're drawing out in terms of, like, theoretical concepts, models. You could talk more about methods. You could talk more about the kind of empirical data, but it is driven entirely by a question.
So, people may or may not be familiar with, say, meta-analysis, where then you're taking findings and actually maybe doing another kind of data analysis with the data from the study. And now where a lot of data sets are being released in conjunction with research articles, how do you see people using that kind of a resource in this type of research?
Yeah, I think different fields probably have varying degrees of maturity in terms of meta-analysis. So it's been around a long time in kind of medical science and medicine. And it's the underpinning kind of method in terms of hierarchy of evidence within a kind of evidence-based practice, evidence-based medicine. And I think in other fields that are slightly sort of behind the curve, but are catching up rapidly, and seeing that meta-analytic studies can address different questions, can give a higher level of confidence in the results that any individual study could. But I'm back to your point earlier. I think we shouldn't get hung up on any one singular approach to synthesis. So a meta-analysis for me is an approach to the synthesis step in a systematic review. But like you said, if you want to do this with qualitative data, then actually all the processes, all of the stages of the review research that I talked about before are exactly the same. It's just that synthesis step of how you actually integrate the findings across studies and integrate your interpretation, your understanding, undertake that analysis is different because you've incorporated that. And that's what we really talked about in this paper, because what we think a lot of more early career and novice researchers really struggle with is the fit between the purpose of the review and the method of the review. And they often get these kind of misaligned. And if you really want to publish in a really high quality, publish a really high quality paper, then that purpose method fit in review research is absolutely crucial. So what you were talking about with meta-analysis is one form of synthesis. It's an approach to and it's also kind of a purpose, and the purpose of meta-analysis is to aggregate the findings to give you a higher level of confidence in an effect size effectively. But that is one of 8 purposes of reviews that we identified in this paper, because we said other reviews might be more classificatory. So your example of I might look at review methods might be saying, well, let's classify and produce a classification of review methods and the types of problems they've been. That's for us is like a classificatory review. You see some reviews that are more visual and they represent the literature, and you see a lot of kind of bibliometric kind of studies now that are kind of almost creating like a network map of the literature, the structure of the literature. We see review types. The third type would be around problematization. So you're there asking, what are the underlying assumptions that you see in the field, and you're challenging some of those assumptions. We see some reviews that are more configurational as a fourth type. And a configuration review would address anyone that has a question like, what are some of the factors and the conditions that are leading to organizational performance? Or to employee motivation, for example, where you've got multiple cases, like multiple case studies published, and then you're looking across the cases to look what are the commonalities in the features that appear across all of those different contexts. That's a configurational review. Then the meta-analysis is an aggregative, so we're aggregating, building the data together. And then we've got a more integrative review. So integrative reviews are when we've got 2 bodies of literature that didn't previously talk to one another, but they're actually addressing the same question. So if we can take some insight from here, can we now integrate that with this literature and give us a new insight? So that's kind of an integrative review. And the last 2, one is the interpretive one. So that's your meta-ethnography, your qualitative. So that's now reinterpret the meaning behind some of what was said in these original studies. And then a more explanatory one is more conceptual, and it's more about theory building and addressing the kind of why issue of explaining a phenomenon and why that phenomenon manifests. So we come up with these 8 purposes or types of review, and then said how you approach them would be slightly different, particularly in your approach to analysis and synthesis, but also in terms of the nature of the kind of data that you're actually included in the review.
Right. I think, in terms of your selection of the articles that you're going to include, and in some of my writing, I've talked about, well, I mean, it's very much the same process you think about in terms of your population and your sample. If you're sampling human participants, you go, well, what's the criteria? Or is it about age? Is it about type of experience, or what country they live in, or how do you decide who you're going to include? And that, similarly here, and you think, well, with all of those different examples, so you might be looking at the same kind of question, but depending on the type of review you're choosing, the criteria for inclusion and exclusion might be very different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the really interesting or important thing to get across. And the real difference between review research and probably kind of traditional literature reviews is that you were never held to those same quality standards when you do a traditional literature review. So you didn't ever really have to say, how did you select your sample of papers?
Right.
As you would. But in a more systematic review research, then you have to be really explicit about what are your inclusion and exclusion criteria. And that can apply and be just as important for qualitative review research as quantitative, because your question earlier about maybe you're going to conduct something that's like a meta-ethnography of different people's perceptions of some phenomena. And the meaning that they draw around that phenomenon. Well, you want to be able to make sure that you've got enough comparability within those studies, that you're not comparing the views of apples and oranges, that you've got some comparison. Otherwise, you're going to get spurious results. And it's the same at the meta-analysis end. You don't want to start aggregating data that are actually, you know, not homogeneous data. There's too much heterogeneity in that data set. So it's kind of the same principles, but you're probably applying more of the principles of qualitative research that we would all be accustomed to as qualitative researchers to the more qualitative review research, and the same quality standards if you're doing something that's more aggregative in quantitative review research. So there is a plurality of methods, and I think that's a strength, because you've got multiple different questions you can address, multiple different methods, but really it is about the purpose and the method fit. Because then if you have a purpose and then you've applied some review research method that is actually not consistent with that, and that's where reviewers or readers of the review will start to ask questions, because it's just incongruent.
Right. Well, it would seem to me that, you know, for our viewers for this discussion who may be doctoral students or early career researchers who are, you know, have the requirement of doing a literature review as the kind of preface to their study to provide the rationale, et cetera, that if they took some of the advice that you're offering here and thought more deeply about how they went about it, then, you know, you're well on your way to not only having this chapter in your thesis or dissertation, but having something that could have the potential for a publication as a standalone piece, and would really strengthen and perhaps be a much more precise foundation for your own research.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I'd add a few points to that, because I do feel that a lot of doctoral students in particular don't get a sufficient grounding in the training of how to do good quality reviews, and they get very good training usually in how to do other methods, but not in the reviews. And even if you walk into a library, there's lots of books on research methods and statistical techniques and so on, and very few on literature reviews, and some of those are quite old. Yet it is the foundation for the thesis. I always think that a literature review in a thesis is like the foundation of a house. And if you get that foundation right, and it's worth making sure you get that grounding absolutely right, because then you can build the house and you can have a beautiful house, but it's really on firm foundation, rather than you might get the subsidence when the examiner starts pressing and asking difficult questions. And my experience as an examiner and as a supervisor and someone that's been involved in running doctoral programs is that a lot of the problems that doctoral students have is when they kind of build the problems in from the start by not having a sufficient grounding in the literature, because they want to move on very quickly and start building a really beautiful house and furnishing all the rooms. And the really kind of difficult bit, or the hard work of grounding that and building that foundation, isn't quite there. And I think it gives you the confidence to move on with the rest of your work.
Mhm.
And actually really good quality review research in a doctoral thesis isn't just the foundation for the thesis, but if someone wants an academic career, it's actually giving that foundation and that grounding for their next set of publications.
Right,
Because a
right.
review research doesn't just address the question and say, what do we know? It should also say, what do we don't know? And
Right.
that should help really formulate those questions for their research and future publications.
Right. So is there anything else you would like to add before we conclude?
Yeah, I'd just say the one thing that I would say, and it was to your point about doctoral researchers and early career researchers, I often think that people think the review research is a kind of lonely exercise and it should be undertaken by people that go and lock themselves in their office or go down to the library and do a piece of research. And my big piece of advice, anyone wants to do some review research, is that actually making your methodology and your purpose more explicit and kind of writing a plan for the review means that you can go and share that with someone. You can get some feedback on it. It creates a structured process. So you've got some clear milestones of when you've completed your searching, when you've doing your selection, you're applying your quality criteria, you're doing your analysis. So that step-by-step process, I think, gives much more opportunity for people to get feedback throughout the process of doing their review research. And I think in that sense, it should be more of a kind of collaborative endeavor and more of a social exercise rather than a kind of lonely existence doing your review.
Well, I can see the value of that as well, because it may be that, in our global online scholarly world that we have now, where, we're on the other in different parts of the globe as we talk right now, that what someone, a colleague in another discipline, in another university or in another country, may have been exposed to some literature that you aren't aware of.
Exactly.
As wonderful as our databases may be, that anybody who's trying to search, you could be like, oh my God, it's either scadzillion of something or like you can't find it at all. Well, this is something that perhaps having the, as you say, deciding what you're doing and being able to articulate that can also help to invite, what have I missed? Is there literature? Are there scholars working in this? Maybe emerging scholars whose work I haven't heard of. What else should I know? So I think that's really an excellent point about the value of collaboration through this kind of process.
Yeah. And I think writing a review protocol, which is effectively a plan for the review, it's a template and it's 2-3 pages, is actually something you can circulate and say, this is my purpose, this is how I'm going to approach it, this is how I'm going to make that alignment between purpose and method. You can get feedback on it, you can share that, you could share it amongst members of your network and find out who else is doing work on this. And it's something that other fields do. So if you look at the Cochrane collaboration within medicine, people put their protocols onto the Cochrane collaboration website. They get reviewed by others and others will give some insight to that. So if there's a more informal way of doing that across other fields, I think it's a great exercise to do.
Well, thank you for talking with me, and I will also include the link to the article in the Organizational Research Methods. And if there are other resources that you'd like to share, please send them. I think this will be very helpful to people who are thinking about either what should I do next in my own research agenda? How can I move the field forward? What do we need to better understand? How can we learn from what's been done to position the next research that needs to be conducted?
Yeah, and please do share it. And if anyone's listening and you've got and someone's undertaking a review, please share it on. And that's why we wrote it, because we do think it will be really helpful for people starting out doing review research, and also people can feel free to reach out to us and the authors of the paper, and if we can help in any further ways, then we will.
Well, thank you very much.